Let's talk CRPG mechanics. I'm on record saying that tabletop role-playing game rules don't work very well in computer role-playing games, but I think that I'm not being clear enough, so let's go into some excruciating detail about what mechanics work in a CRPG and what mechanics don't. Now, I'm not saying that D&D is too clunky on the computer. It is clunky on the computer, but CRPGs are notoriously clunk resistant. You can stick a lot of clunk in these bad boys and people will still play them. Now, the problem is that the mechanics you use limit the stories you can tell. Mechanics are how players interact with your game world. So if you want the players to be able to get touched by the narrative, the mechanics have to reach the narrative. They don't have to cause the narrative, but they have to give the players a way to interact with the narrative. If the mechanics can't do that, then the players can't reach the narrative, and the narrative is just floating off in space somewhere doing its own thing. Now, it's not that D&D is a bad set of mechanics for reaching narratives, it's that D&D was built for a different kind of narrative. D&D is built to be a way to facilitate a 6-player social game. The rules of D&D were never the fun part of the game. The rules are simply a way to get everybody seated around the same table playing the same game for the same reason. The rules of D&D are a scaffold that you scurry across while you build your fantasy. It's the same with a computer RPG. The rules of a computer RPG and the mechanics of a computer RPG are a way for you to move through the game and have your adventure. These are scaffolds that allow us to build our narratives. But this scaffold, this D&D scaffold, was intended for 6 people to scurry across it simultaneously. It's probably not suitable for very many computer games. There aren't very many computer games where that is the objective. So I figured we could give some more specific examples. What sort of narrative beats can happen and can't happen because of the rules you choose? Well, let's go ahead and take a little sampler of every RPG ever made, every CRPG ever made. I don't want to try and come up with like the 19 best CRPGs that are ever made. Obviously, I don't want to get into that argument with everybody, so I just asked Mr. Google, and Mr. Google said that MrIggen.com said that these were the top 19. I don't really care how accurate this is, it's just for example's sake. On this list, we have 2.5 D&D licensed games. We got Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, sort of a D&D license, kind of floating up here at number 14. Down here, we've got Planescape Torment, a classic. And suspiciously high on the list at number 3, Baldur's Gate 2. The rest of these games don't use licensed rules. They specifically use bespoke rules. They use rules that they chose to serve their narratives on purpose. But what about these 3 here? What did they do? How did D&D help them tell their stories? Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, that's a game that's about the light side and the dark side. And if you think about the things that impressed you about that game, you might think of the vast tracts of space you had to explore while keeping your light side and your dark side in mind, fighting your inner demons. In fact, you have light side and dark side powers. It's monitored. All of your party members have a light side and dark side track. And wait a minute, light side and dark side, that's got nothing to do with D&D. They have a completely different alignment system, and they don't have special force-sensitive powers at all. This is a completely new mechanic that they introduced into the world just so they could tell their Star Wars story. Oh, okay. Well, how about Planescape Torment? Planescape Torment, what do you remember enjoying about that game? Was it the eon-spanning story of a god that keeps dying and being reborn and struggling to come to grips with eternity wait, that whole death and rebirth and changing thing, that's also a new mechanic that they introduced specifically to tell the story. That's got nothing to do with D&D. In fact, it conflicts with many of the things that happen in D&D. So once again, they introduced a new mechanic to help tell their story. Alright, what about Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn? The many things we remember about that, like, go for the eyes! Boo! Wait, did that game have anything else in it? Was that even Baldur's Gate 2, or was that Baldur's Gate 1? Nobody remembers Baldur's Gate 2. I'll just cross that off the list. Aside from Baldur's Gate 2, all of these games have mechanics that help to tell their stories. Like, obviously, Pokemon Yellow, you are trying to collect and train Pokemon. You create teams of Pokemon. Those mechanics allow you to approach the narrative of Pokemon Yellow. And to be honest, I don't remember the narrative of Pokemon Yellow, but I'm 99% sure it involved fighting gym leaders, which is something that is only compelling because you are training up teams of Pokemon and cycling Pokemon in and out of those teams. That mechanic is supported by the battle system and the way that types interact and the way that you collect and train Pokemon. Trying to create a gym leader combat system for another game like, say, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic wouldn't work because the rules of that game just don't fit the gym leader narrative. The only way that gym leader narrative works is because you're training up an ever-changing team of Pokemon, and that requires the mechanics to do certain things. A similar game, Persona 4 Golden, has a similar set of rules. You're training up an ever-cycling list of basically Pokemon to do your fighting. But Persona 4 Golden has a different set of mechanics and tells a very different style of story. The gym leader setup from Pokemon Yellow is turned into a captured TV land setup for Persona 4 Golden. It's the same fundamental structure, but slight differences in how the mechanics work. Persona 4 Golden has you with team members that take on personas rather than having the personas themselves be the characters. That means that the way that these unfold and the way that you touch these narrative beats feels quite different. In Persona 4 Golden, you're not challenging a gym leader. You're challenging someone that's been taken over by the dark side of their persona, which can only happen because of the mechanics of Persona. We couldn't do that in Pokemon Yellow because that would mean the gym leaders would all have to be Pokemon, and that really wouldn't make any sense. So you can see how the mechanics support the narrative. They allow us to touch the narrative. And we can do this with all of these games. Remember Final Fantasy VI? If you haven't played Final Fantasy VI, I don't know what you're doing on my channel. A big part of the draw of Final Fantasy VI comes from the way that they constantly remix your party. New party members come and go all the time, at least for the first half of the game, and they use this to really explore a lot of powerful themes in a lot of really interesting ways. Just in the first half hour of the game, you play as 3 different characters. This is supported by the mechanics of that game. First off, it's supported by the combat mechanics. Final Fantasy VI does not have 4.5 different combat roles that are always required right from the beginning. Instead, the only real combat roles are front row and back row. But every single character you have has really unique combat capabilities. Like, did you memorize all of Sabin's various Street Fighter moves? Have you figured out how to use the sword-wielding techniques of the samurai? Have you mastered Terra's special glowy stuff? All of these individual characters can be mastered, and the combat is mostly a way to give you an opportunity to use those characters, rather than trying to be balanced to require those characters. Because the combat balance is specifically created to be like this, they can just remix the party willy-nilly and not worry too much about whether or not you're going to be totally screwed. The chaos of a battle in Final Fantasy VI is very low. There's not usually a whole lot of surprises in any given individual battle, whereas in D&D, you roll a d20 and who knows? anything could happen. The chaos in a D&D game is much higher, and usually there's a lot more strategy involved in a D&D game because you're trying to win the battle rather than use your characters. Do you see? But in addition to the combat mechanics, Final Fantasy VI has a large number of mini-games. So does Chrono Trigger, for that matter. Chrono Trigger starts out with a bunch of mini-games. Let's play some mini-games. These techniques of allowing the player to engage with the narrative through one-off mini-games, like in Final Fantasy VI, there's that sequence where you're rafting around in a whole bunch of places and you're trying to figure out where to go next. It's basically a mini-game, right? These are small one-off mechanics that specifically serve the purpose of allowing you to engage with that one narrative beat at that one moment. Choosing your mechanics allows you to tell the narrative beats you want to tell in the most effective way, because they allow the player to reach the narrative beats you want them to be able to reach. Games that aren't on this list, up there somewhere, will often have narrative beats that you can't actually reach because there are just no mechanics that let you. So the stories are good, but you can't be there. You can't get to them. And I think that is the difference between a mediocre RPG and a fantastic RPG. Can you actually tell the story you want to tell? Now, this isn't to say that all tabletop RPG rule sets are incapable of telling CRPG stories. Obviously, that's not true. We've got a couple right here on the list that do fine. But it's a tremendous limitation. And percentage-wise, we have had a lot of that one particular set of mechanics. There are more stories to tell, and I think that we might be getting pretty threadbare on this one set of mechanics and repeating the same stories over and over and over. So I want to think more about the kinds of mechanics that would allow us to tell the stories we want to tell. And this is not mysterious. The only reason it's hard to talk about is because we're not used to thinking about narratives as things the players have to be able to mechanically touch. And I think we need to be talking about that. Let me know what you think. See ya.